This has obviously been a pretty tough winter by way of weather, and so I'm well aware that some of you have been having to kind of dance in and out of different services on Sunday mornings, and so you might feel a little lost at sea if I just start right into today's sermon without maybe doing a brief recap of where we've been so far in this sermon series that I'm calling Flickering. So just a real quick recap, even if you're brand new today, maybe this will help you a little bit so you don't feel lost at sea. We are exploring for a few weeks here the first few chapters of the book of Revelation, which is the last book of the Bible, the last book of the New Testament. And the book of Revelation, if you've read it before, as I talked about a few weeks ago, it's really the record of this really stunning vision that God gave to a man by the name of John. And you're probably somewhat familiar with John, if only for this reason, he was one of the followers of Jesus. And God gives John this vision of how everything from that time in ancient New Testament times all the way up until the end of time, how everything is going to unfold, kind of what it's going to look like, a big picture battle between God and evil and the stand that the church makes in the midst of all this. And so if you've read Revelation, you recognize then, because it is a vision, it is filled with all kinds of bizarre, trippy imagery and symbolism that is so intimidating and overwhelming at times. And in fact, in the very first chapter of Revelation, Act 1, Scene 1, we've got an image that we've got to figure out what on earth it means. John is standing there, and he says, "Before me I looked and I saw seven lampstands." I've got these little small miniature lampstands here with me this morning, had in the last couple of weeks. John says in Revelation 1, "I saw these seven lampstands," and it's a very bizarre thing for us too when we read of that. And so it's a really wonderful gift from God that Jesus comes among John and says, "John, let me tell you exactly what those lampstands are symbolic of, what they are representative of." And Jesus says each of those lampstands, they represent a church. Which, as I said a couple of weeks ago, is really a beautiful image for the church, isn't it? I love the idea of this lampstand because the church is a very planted, standing presence in the world. And what I love even more so, of course, in a lampstand is they hold on top of them some kind of lantern-like casing that holds within it a light. And so what I expressed to you is the beauty of this imagery is that the church is standing in the midst of the world and is elevating this light that is so representative of and symbolic of the kind of life and vibrancy that we have because of what God has done through Jesus. As well as we talked about last week, it's not just a symbol of our salvation and us being redeemed and things being put right, but the light is also witness. It's kind of this declaring presence in the world that we want all to know the story of what God is doing through Jesus. So this lampstand, it's a beautiful image for the church. And what we do then is we read on in Revelation 1 and on into 2 and 3, and Jesus helps us understand that these seven different lampstands are representative of seven different churches from seven different cities of the ancient New Testament world, where we would find all of them in modern-day Turkey. So you've got Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea, seven major cities at the time of the writing of the book of Revelation. And Jesus, in Revelation 2 and 3, writes a series of seven letters to each of these churches. And he wants to minister to them, and he wants to help them along, because quite frankly, when we read Revelation 2 and 3, we begin to realize that their stories are kind of pathetic, if I can put it bluntly. I've used the imagery, and it's why we call this series Flickering, is because the light that these churches hold at that time of the writing, the time of the giving of the vision to John, that the light that they hold is flickering and it's flirting with fading because of so many different factors in their lives. So last week, we looked at the very first letter in Revelation chapter 2, verses 1 through 7, a letter to the church in Ephesus, and we found out the reason why the flame that is their life in Jesus is flickering and flirting with fading is because they were all tenacity and very little tenderness. I had some good conversations this last week on the other side of that sermon. Revelation chapter 2, then, verses 8 through 11, we have a second letter. It's a letter that's written to the church in Smyrna. And I want to read that for you now, and you can follow along up on the screen, Revelation 2, 8 and following. "And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write the words of the first and the last, who died and came to life. Smyrna, I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich. And the slander of those who say that they are Jews and they're really not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Smyrna, do not fear, do not be afraid what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested. And for 10 days you will have tribulation. But Smyrna, be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. For the one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. That's Revelation chapter 2, verses 8 through 11, this letter to Smyrna. One of the things that I've noticed through the years from time to time in studying the book of Revelation is, of course, scholars have a lot of different opinions about a lot of different things in the book of Revelation. And one of the things, though, that's kind of universally accepted among scholars and all the world of academia that's trying to figure out what this book even means is they all say to themselves, you know what, we've got these 7 letters that Jesus writes to these 7 churches, but out of these 7 letters, really 2 of them, they don't really have a negative word at all from Jesus. And what I mean by that is, remember last week when we looked at the letter with Ephesus, there was a very clear moment where Jesus says, but this I hold against you. You have let go of the love that you had at first. A pretty negative, confrontational moment of accountability from Jesus. But scholars say that doesn't happen in all the letters. I mean, if you look at the letter, the one that I just read to you, the letter that was written to the church in Smyrna, and in a couple of weeks when I read for you the letter that Jesus wrote for Philadelphia, I mean, really just very positive. And I've always found that, quite frankly, to be kind of confusing to me, as if this idea is very present that there were back then a couple of perfect churches. They had it all together, all figured out, everything in its right place, their minds all set in the right directions, their actions being lived so perfectly. It just seems to be like no one wants to rummage around a bit and realize that maybe, just maybe, Jesus is trying to do a little bit of confrontation and a little bit of accountability, not necessarily so potently and pointedly and directly, but sometimes he does it a little more subtly. And I think that is the case in the letter to Smyrna. Because the thing is, when I read this letter, and so many scholars say it's just largely positive, well, first of all, you can't possibly say it's largely positive. It is dealing with profound persecution. It's kind of negative. But personally, for the way they're living their lives as a church, when I read this letter, I think in a very subtle way, Jesus is trying to expose to them, look, I see the foundation of who you are. I know it, and I see it, and I wonder over it, and I find it beautiful. But Jesus seems to be indicating that he sees some spidery cracks within the foundation of who they are as a church. Because what I think, if you really look closely at this letter to Smyrna, is that this is the church that is dealing with a real swirl of fear and doubt, and so they've got this wavering faith in their midst. Their flame is flickering too, and is flirting with fading because of the swirl of fear and doubt and a wavering faith. And the reason I say that is, take into consideration the 2 most important commandments that Jesus gives them in this letter. Smyrna, do not be afraid. Why else would he have to say that except that I know that you have some fear, some real fear. But then also he has to go forward and say, Smyrna, be faithful even unto death. What has to be behind that but the idea that maybe there's some kind of wavering somewhere where they're kind of looking over their shoulder and they're fearful, and there may be some of them becoming consumed by that to the point where their faith is wavering. They're really questioning whether or not they really want to have this profound faithfulness in the midst of all of this suffering. So, and you ask the question, well, why would they be having fear and doubt and wavering faith? For goodness sakes, when you read this letter, isn't it very clear, right? Even with all some of the different strange imagery, isn't it clear that they're not having a good stretch right now in Smyrna? Profound persecution. In fact, one of the things that we can tell from this letter and from history is that all of the Roman citizens, and Smyrna was an established Roman city in the ancient culture, that Roman citizens were not very fond of Christians, and here's why. Because when we study the history of Smyrna, what we learn about them is that really outside of maybe the city of Rome, if there was a city in ancient culture that the Roman Empire really loved, it was Smyrna, because they were just a bunch of kiss-ups. There's no way around it. They were the very first city to erect a temple to the glory of the goddess Roma, which was Rome's own little, patented, their special little goddess that they created to speak to the glory and the triumph and the spirit of Rome. And Smyrna was the first said, you know what, we want to build a temple to glorify the spirit and the victory of Rome. You think Roman emperors like to hear that? They probably love Smyrna an awful lot. And it's not just because they did that, but because they were one of the first cities to start erecting temples to the glory and the worship of some of the Roman emperors. The first woman to do it built it to Augustus. That's in Pergamum. That's the group we're going to talk about next week. But we do know from history that what Smyrna did back in this time was they erected a temple. They beat out 10 different cities after this huge money-draining campaign to build the first temple in honor of the great Roman Emperor Tiberius. Think Roman emperors love Smyrna? Of course they do, because Smyrna loves them. It says they're the great, worships them. So then when Rome sends out the order and says, you know what, every single Roman citizen needs to bow at some point during the day, whenever they are asked by Roman officials, they must hit their knees, bow before that Roman official, and declare that Caesar is Lord. Basically, Caesar is God over all. And when that order went out in Smyrna, they were glad to hit their knees and cleared their throats. The problem, of course, is then they have this whole emerging group of Christians who refuse to do that, who refuse to hit their knees and clear their throats and declare Caesar as Lord because they will only declare that Jesus Christ is Lord. And you think that went over well with Smyrna? Then you're going to wreck our relationship with Rome. We've got it good right now. Rome loves us, and you're going to be a bunch of jerks there and not declare that Caesar is Lord? And so persecution probably would have started out in social sectors, kind of freezing them out by way of business. And maybe that's why Jesus says, I know some of you are in an impoverished state. They've probably been losing business and money because they're getting frozen out because they won't declare Caesar as Lord. It probably went further into the political realm of, maybe some temporary imprisonment. But we do know, at least from this, Jesus gives them a heads up, and we do realize this in the rest of history that we can read even outside of the Bible, that at some point it got worse and worse and worse, even for believers there in Smyrna, that if they would not declare that Caesar was Lord, some of them were not just temporarily imprisoned, but imprisoned for long, crushing periods of time away from their family. Some of them were given crippling fines, and they were stripped of their jobs, again, impoverished. And then we do know at some point when it was truly outlawed and there were some more vindictive emperors in power that some of them lost their lives. In fact, we read about one church leader in Smyrna, a guy by the name of Polycarp. You can read about the moment in which he was dragged before the officials, would not declare Caesar as Lord, and so they burnt him at the stake. It wasn't easy to be a believer in Smyrna. And it's not just because of Roman officials, but when you hear that text, do you hear that when Jesus makes this mention of Jews who aren't really Jews? He's talking about the fact that, quite frankly, the Jews weren't big fans of Christians either. And you probably know that because, quite frankly, when they came along and Christians were talking about Jesus and about a fulfillment of the law and that Jesus has taken us in a new direction into this new age of the Spirit and of grace, that all the Jews got uncomfortable. How dare you mock our law and mock Moses and mock the very foundations of who we are? And they wanted to find any way they could to drive Christians out of their cities so that they could still have a Jewish stronghold. And you know what Jews did in Smyrna? And this is why Jesus says, how could these Jews actually be true Jews in their heart? Because they're driving out God's own people. This is what they would do, is that the Jews in that time had a special little relationship with Rome in a lot of different provinces and cities where the Roman officials let them practice their religion, and they wouldn't make them or force them to declare that Caesar is Lord. And I don't know if it's just because of some nice political allowance, because the Jews were willing to yield to everything, or because, quite frankly, the Romans realized the Jews kind of make the world go around a little bit for us in certain regions, so let's not upset the workforce too much. But they had this nice little agreement for stretches of time with Rome, but the Christians didn't have that agreement with Rome. And so we have historical reason to believe that Jews would go around and report Christians to Romans officials and say, hey, they're not declaring Caesar as Lord. And so Jews, even Jews, God-fearing Jews, were having Christians thrown into prison, making sure Christians were impoverished and crippled by fear and doubt and maybe even losing their lives. So when I talk about Smyrna being caught up in the swirl of fear and of doubt and of a wavering faith, I mean, quite frankly, why on earth would they be? Well, for goodness sakes, profoundly persecuted. It was not easy to be a believer in Smyrna. That's what Jesus goes on and says, it's like a synagogue, like a Satan here. The Jews are throwing you to the wolves. The Romans are throwing you to the wolves. I know the tribulation and the suffering that you're going through. But the truth is, Reen, the more and more I think about it, I don't think that's just the deepest and truest answer to the question as to why they had fear and doubt and a wavering faith. I don't think it's just because of profound persecution. The more I've thought about it, the more I've wondered if maybe one of the issues that Smyrna faces, they went into all of this with this, really with their eyes half closed. And not realizing that the Christian life is not necessarily a life that's going to be absent of suffering. That this seems to have left them shell-shocked and surprised. And Jesus having to come along to them and saying, just to be clear, we will suffer. Did anyone tell you that? And I want to be careful. Maybe someone did in Smyrna. One of the traveling apostles came through and was very clear to explain to them the Christian life is not a life that is void of suffering. And maybe they've forgotten it. Maybe as it was passed on from generation to generation, the older generation said, maybe we ought to hold back that information. Or maybe someone was very clear and told them the whole story that there will be suffering in Christian faith and profound brokenness in Christian faith and following Jesus and wanting to be like Jesus. And yet all the believers in Smyrna thought to themselves, that can't possibly be true of Smyrna, because as we study the history of Smyrna, it seemed like a pretty friendly, accommodating place, a bunch of kiss-ups. There's no way that's going to happen in Smyrna. It'd be kind of like how we'd feel if someone said, hey, there's going to be a profound persecution in Plainfield. Really? Conservativeville, Plainfield? Nah. Or maybe there were people who came along and only told them half the story. You know, maybe there were people who were kind of like the televangelist types that we have these days. You know what I'm talking about? The toothy guys and the big-haired gals that you see on TV. Skip services here, maybe flip through the channels and you catch a whiff of what they're teaching. There's people on TV who traipse around and say about the Christian faith, you know what, man, it's just going to be the best. It's going to be great. When you accept Jesus, it's going to be one personal dream after another coming true, and like all of your troubles, financial, spiritual, emotional, psychological, physical, man, you're just going to let go of them like helium-filled balloons from the circus. You're going to wake up in the morning and go to work on a golden brick road atop a unicorn. People will cheer for you, beloved, stunningly successful you. You hear that garbage all the time. You don't think they had cats like that back then? Their own televangelists going around and just giving half the story? And yet here comes Jesus along into Smyrna and realizes this cannot stand, and there has to be someone who very soberly stands before my believers and before this church and says, look, you will suffer. If you're doing it right, if you're choosing me exclusively over all of the other kings and princes and powers of this world, and if you're choosing to look like me daily in the way that you're living your life, I mean, there's going to be ridicule and there's going to be rejection. You will absolutely suffer. Suffer. That's what Jesus does in Smyrna, because he realizes the problem they're facing is that they're only told half the story. That with the first sign of persecution and suffering and rejection of ridicule, they're going to spin and run the other direction. It seems to be what they're somewhat doing right now. Don't be afraid, Smyrna. Be faithful unto the end. We knew this was going to happen. There's no way, because of what I taught my followers and what they should have taught you, is that you're not necessarily going to see these situations and want to file them under, unbelievably great, but you can't file them under unexpected. I have told you from the beginning that your flame might burn blue even at the first sign of trouble. You will suffer. I mean, for goodness sakes, when I came your direction, I turned to you and I said, you have to repent. You didn't like that, did you? We're all pretty fond of living as gods over our own lives. You think when you go out among people and trying to push them in this direction of a new, beautiful kingdom, even though it's beautiful, you think they're going to love the pain of that? You will suffer if you're doing it right. You will suffer. That's one of the things that I find so fascinating about Jesus, and I'm making my way here to a very critical point of application for us as a people and as a church, is one of the things that I found so fascinating about Jesus. This was true for me going through Matthew. We spent like a year and a half in Matthew. And one of the things that stood out to me is the more I looked at Jesus and studied just what he did and what he shared with people, he is the most consistently strange recruiter I've ever seen in my life. You know, recruiting people to come follow him, or people who have already decided to follow him, how he would recruit more loyalty and faithfulness. Just the most consistently strange recruiter I have ever seen in my life. I mean, he steps in the world and he tells them really great things. The kingdom of God is here, and it's going to be like oxygen to your soul, and it's going to draw you in. And there's such life, and there's such vibrancy, and you're going to see things being put back together that you would never imagine them being put back together. And so he does often lead with all of these wonderful and good and beautiful things. But then he is so quick to turn around and say, but here's the deal. When I send you out into certain villages, whole entire cities at times will turn themselves against you and drive you out. And you're going to go home and you're going to bring up all of this with your family. And you're going to all of a sudden realize, oh, well, goodness sakes, Jesus brought a sword with him that is sometimes dividing a father from his son and a mother from her daughter. So you're going to have a lot of discord within your own family. And I'm going to send you out, and you're beginning to realize that there's going to be entire government systems that will set themselves against the kingdom of God. Some of you will be imprisoned. Some of you will have all of these crippling fines. Some of you will recognize that you're going to lose your own life. You're going to recognize that every single day you have to take up your cross. This humiliating idea of you being treated as if you are a criminal who has been unjustly charged with all these heinous crimes. The strangest recruiter I've ever seen in my life. I mean, could you imagine someone doing that now? Like all across the high school, these college representatives are coming into high school classrooms and lunchrooms and setting up their little trifold displays, and they've got their little parkas and polos on to talk about such and such a university. Could you imagine a university representative speaking like that? I mean, starting by saying we're the best in the nation. I feel really great about the education that we can give you. But you need to realize if you come, half the student body is going to hate you. And probably the teachers too. And right now, the accreditation group, they're not real comfortable with all that we're teaching. And so after a while, it might be that most people aren't going to think your degree is worth anything. Oh, and I see that you have your mom here today. She's probably going to be profoundly disappointed in you coming here. Would you like a pamphlet? Or could you imagine someone trying to recruit someone that way? I mean, Jesus is the strangest, most consistently strange recruiter I've ever seen in my life, but doggone it if he isn't the most stunningly effective. And what I mean by that is not necessarily like in every wake of every city where he went, he came with thousands of people wanting to follow him hardcore. In fact, we read about a lot of people who said, and on that day, many of them left him and followed him no more. Or left with great sadness like the rich young ruler. I mean, really, in the end, it ends up where he's like, okay, I've still got 12, actually 11 guys all in with me. The beginning of Acts, we got 120 maybe. So on some fronts you could push back, but when you really think about it, think about the loyalty that happened on the other side of this really bizarre recruiting. And people who followed him all the way through the cross and on to the resurrection, and then they recruited more people, and those people recruited more people, and they're all doing this strange recruiting, and like, hey, this is going to be really beautiful and also really bizarrely strange and difficult at times. But here you and I are today. He's the strangest recruiter I've ever seen in my life, but the most stunningly effective, and the reason why is because he was the most relentlessly honest. The most honest recruiter that you'll ever see in your life. You'll never confuse Jesus with a used car salesman. You're never going to get a sniff or even a whiff of a bait and switch kind of deal. He lays it all out there, and he does it with Smyrna. Look, you will suffer. You may even suffer gravely. Now, he still has the good stuff. I'm the first and the last. I die, but I am alive. I can give you the crown of life. And he comes back to the positives, but he is relentlessly honest. Can you imagine if he went the televangelist route? You and I wouldn't be here today. Now, here's the point of application that I find myself really being drawn to in the midst of this letter to Smyrna. Is that what I've found myself thinking about this is that here we are in America, and we talk so often about how the church is really struggling along and limping along, and quite frankly, that there's so much about our own flame that's flickering and flirting with fading. Do you think it's maybe a little bit tied in with to what we do or don't do when it comes to trying to raise up followers of Jesus? Because a lot of times we sound like your regular old recruiter. I've been thinking to myself a lot last week when I was using the image of us being a people of tenacity, those clenched fists who are clinging to truth. And in one hand, we're holding so firmly this idea of who Jesus is and who he calls us to be, and we won't let that go. But we also recognize, man, he says there's going to be some really difficult things. But when we're trying to speak to people, sometimes we want to put one hand behind our back, and we want to extol all of the joys of what it means to follow Jesus. Do you not understand the damage that we do? Because this thing right behind our back suddenly becomes quite a left hook that just catches people. They cut tails and all since I was promised unicorns, you know? And I think about that sometimes with even with our little ones. Like we talk a lot about these whole younger generations who were off they go into the world and they seem to never kind of come back into the fold of a community of faith. Well, could it very well be that we're not doing a really good job sometimes of sitting back and saying, look, man, it's going to be beautiful, but it's going to be really stinking hard. There's a lot about this kingdom of Christ that is incredibly countercultural, and the rejection and the ridicule is going to be intense. Not too long ago that we got news that my niece Carissa was going to be baptized, and we weren't able to be there. It was on a Sunday, and we obviously had duties here. And Sarah's really good about this. She said, let's send a card, and a little gift and all that kind of stuff. And so she got a card, and she goes, why don't you write, the card to Carissa? And I sat down, and I sat there for I don't know how long trying to figure out, what do I want to write in this card on the day of someone's baptism? And I felt confronted by the fact that so often when I've spoken of life in Jesus Christ and faith in Jesus Christ, that so often on a day of baptism, it's all extolling joy, and there's no real sober moment to really speak over them, the kind of profound brokenness that they're going to face at times. Like very few times do we ever sit back and really tell our young ones, this is a beautiful moment. But one of the things is baptism, and it's beautiful, risen anew in Jesus Christ. But what's the other part of it? You're buried. There's a death to self here. And I know we're like, I don't know if I want to talk to a kid about that. We've got to. Because when they go out and about and they feel the sting and the pain of this, there has to be something that speaks to them that this is not unbelievably good, but this is not unexpected. And so I fill out this card to Kristen where I'm trying to balance out joy, but also tell her, I will be praying for you. Because this is a tough road to walk. There's probably a reason why I don't even get to fill out birthday cards usually. Happy birthday, just another day closer to death. But in all honesty, there's something to me when I sit back, I'd rather us be relentlessly honest because honesty has a way of breeding profound loyalty, doesn't it? I mean, we're here. And so there are these moments where I think to myself, if we would just learn as a church from the letter of Smyrna that maybe a flame can burn blue again, that if we raise up not just a new generation, but one another, even with adults, each of us now, to raise us up in the very sobering reality, we will suffer. And in fact, maybe if we're not doing it right. We will suffer. We can learn from the church of Smyrna in this. But there's also the second thing in this text as well, that it's not just this idea of we will suffer, but it's Jesus coming along in this letter and saying very clearly, eyes wide open, we are going to suffer, but eyes wide open too, it is not suffering without end. It's not suffering without end. And that's very important to add into this. With our young ones, to one another, is to consistently remind ourselves this is not suffering without end. This suffering has a shelf life. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because, quite frankly, most of my preaching, whenever I've dealt with pain and suffering, has often landed in that area. And I want to come back and talk about the danger of that and something I felt very confronted about this last couple of weeks. But I don't want to ignore this because one of the things about the letter to Smyrna is that we're being implored by Jesus not to paint too rosy a picture of the Christian life. But also, if you rummage around in the letter, you realize it's also Jesus imploring us not to paint too dark a picture of the Christian life. I really am moved by this moment in verse 10 in the letter that Jesus writes there in Revelation 2, verse 10, when he says, and you will for 10 days Suffer great tribulation. Again, all the scholars have all kinds of fun trying to figure out what exactly does 10 mean, what's the symbolism, and this, that, and the other. And I think there probably is some symbolism. We'll come back to that in a moment. But really, when it comes back to it, and I get really bored reading all these scholars half the time, I sit back and I say, you know what I think the significance of 10 is? It's Jesus very simply telling us this is not suffering without end. There's a very real beginning, a very real middle, and there will be a very real end. Again, it comes back to even the characteristics that Jesus lays out at the front of the letter. I'm the first and the last. I'm the one who was dead but came back to life, suffering, a very real beginning, middle, but then an end. I think it's Jesus very passionately trying to tell us, look, here's the deal, Smyrna. I know the tribulation you are facing now, and I know the tribulation that you're going to face, and I don't want to belittle that, but I also don't want to overinflate it. You know, suffering can be a god, can it? That you tremble before, that you cower under. And what Jesus is trying to do is to steal the air out of this overwhelming, crippling idea of suffering that's always hanging over us like a dark cloud. He said, I don't want to belittle it. It's painful. I weep with you. I hurt with you. But I also want you to realize 10 days. A very real beginning, middle, and end. This is not suffering without end. Now, soberly, it might mean that the end of this suffering is death. Doesn't Jesus say that? Remain faithful unto death. And some Christians did die right there in Smyrna. But then again, that draws back to the power of the characteristics of who Jesus is. I've defeated death. I'm the first and the last. I have contained death by my life, death, burial, and resurrection. What is the hope that we cling to in the Christian faith, but that death has been rendered ultimately powerless? So that it's only a delivery, a gateway, an entrance into life. The crown of life, Jesus says at the end of the letter. It could mean an end that will happen in their lifetime. We know that the Roman Empire did fall, that there seemed to be grand openings to a lot of openness to the Christian faith. Maybe it happens there. And of course, on a very high altitude level, I think Revelation 2 is already hinting at the things we'll read. If you want to read on in Revelation, read 17, 18, 19, 20, and watch how Jesus, when all things are done, he dismisses all semblances, all representations and manifestations of evil from the dragon, and all this terrible, awful stuff, just wipes it from the face of the earth, giving it a fiery judgment. This is not suffering without end on even the grandest scale. So eyes wide open, we will suffer, eyes wide open, but this suffering is not suffering without end. And let me just close with this quickly, because I think this is really important too. Eyes wide open, we will suffer. Eyes wide open, this is not suffering without end, but also this, eyes wide open, then maybe we all, as we read this letter to Smyrna, maybe we all ought to realize, okay, eyes wide open here, maybe we ought to just learn how to embrace suffering. So this is a huge mistake that I have made often in my preaching. Just totally confess this to you. And I've done it here at Reunion. It's a huge mistake. I have so often camped out in the first 2 points of my preaching. We will suffer, but it is not suffering without end. Now look, here's the deal. I'm not going to make an apology for those sermons, because I think it's very important for us to realize there's a shelf life to our suffering. And also to realize that we will indeed suffer. But what's happened is that through my own preaching, I think the American church does this especially, is that when we just keep preaching, we will suffer, but don't worry, it's suffering without end, is that steady diet of preaching stirs in us a desire not to explore the beauty of suffering, but rather just to try and wait it out, right? I mean, why do you think certain literary series like Left Behind, where it's just like, well, one day God will just pull us out and we won't have to deal with it at all? I mean, we clamor for that because we think if we can just wait this suffering out, we know it's going to come to an end, and it creates distance and all kinds of terrible things as a church. As opposed to maybe if God in his power and his sovereignty allows for this kind of suffering to happen. I mean, look at Jesus in this letter. You are suffering and you will suffer. There's no note where Jesus says, and you know what, I'm going to make sure it doesn't happen at all. You don't even have to do 10 days. But if God and Christ and the Spirit and all of their understanding of what is necessary, they allow it to happen, then maybe the ultimate call through this letter of Smyrna is, how might we embrace suffering as believers and not just wait it out? Just try and get through it with grit and spit. Because could it very well be a gift for us personally, but also, and this is important, a gift for others. One of the things that I get moved by here in this letter is when Jesus says, the devil's going to throw some of you in prison in order that you might be tested. And what's fascinating to me about that is it's very clear the devil's going to do what he can to throw you in prison there in Smyrna and make you suffer, and there's going to be tribulation. And yet this word, in order that you might be tested, that's a really bizarre word in the ancient language because you could translate it tested or tempted. So which is it? I mean, you could very well say the devil's going to throw you in prison that you might be tempted so that you would give up your faith. But the translation I read from, and I think they're right to do this because it captured this really kind of confusing, tense nature of the text. They say, no, tested. And so what they kind of they're indicating here in their own translation is, here's the deal. The devil might throw you into prison, but really when you consider all of the power of God and in his sovereignty, then maybe he's allowing you to be thrown into prison. So maybe it's not just that you're being tempted, but maybe God is using this somehow to test you, which is a word in the ancient language. Again, we talked about this, which is about the refinement of metals, getting rid of impurities and maturing the beauty of this metal. Maybe, just maybe, this is being allowed for your own good. Now, here's the deal, Reunion. When I sit there and say that, and I'll probably even listen to it later, I cringe because I don't want to belittle the depth and the ugliness of the suffering we go through. But again, I don't want to overinflate it to such a degree that we don't realize that significant maturing processes happen in suffering. It's one of those things, and you said it to me, and I've said it to you sometimes, is you look back at these terrible moments in your life, and doggone if you don't sit there sometimes and you're like, I don't know if I could go back in time, if I would have that happen or not. And it's bizarre. And when you say that, you're not belittling the pain, and you're saying it was incredibly horrible. But I don't know if I would trade this refining process that happened in the midst of all this. I'm fascinated by this, not just for us. We come to that conclusion as believers, but also people who are still wrestling with spirituality. I just finished reading through a memoir by Michael J. Fox. I always liked Michael J. Fox a lot, and I'd never read this memoir he wrote back in like 2002 or 2003. And as you know his story, he got what diagnosed with what's called early onset Parkinson's. 30 years old, and he has Parkinson's. And as I'm reading this book by Michael J. Fox, he sits back and he confesses that he doesn't know where he lands on all the things of spirituality and faith and religion and all of that. One of the things he said back, he said, I don't know if I could go back in time, if I would take this from me. Because what he points out is, if Parkinson's hadn't killed me, I think I would have killed myself by the way I was living my life. And so most of the book is this tension of, ultimately, in his language, title of the book, I'm a lucky man. And so it's one of those things that maybe God allows these things that we can be tested and that there can be a refinement that happens for us. So maybe we ought to embrace suffering, not run from it, not always be talking about, well, when's this going to end? But rather, as I'm in it, what is this doing to me? What is this revealing to me? What are the weaknesses this is pointing out to me? But it's not just for us. See, this is one of my great weaknesses in preaching about suffering and wanting to grow from it. Let's not be narcissistic. This isn't just about you growing from your suffering. It's about others that benefit and grow and have life because of your suffering. Isn't that typically American to sit back and say, well, it's okay that I suffer because God is growing me. You know what? He wants to grow others through you, even in your suffering. And I don't even mean that just by the typical, although I'll start there, the idea that sometimes by the way that we are sustained by God, it speaks volumes to people who watch us suffer, but to be sustained in it. And to cling to the idea this is not suffering without end, but this is suffering that is refining me, that is nudging me closer to a crown of life. How many times have you people come up to me, they've watched you suffer in some sense and say, I have no idea how you did it. Well, let me tell you a story. But it's not even just that, but I think sometimes about the kinds of stands that Christians have made throughout history in areas of injustice and in areas where there is lack of compassion, where the church has chosen to be a people of justice because that's what we're called to, and yet the church has suffered greatly for that. Do you not realize that our suffering, when we make a stand in the midst of injustice for the sake of justice, that our suffering is for the sake of others? I shrink back in horror when I think about all of the ways history could have been different if the church hadn't made the kinds of stand that she made, even about sometimes political issues, sometimes about social issues right there. Just the stand they make about racial issues. Because we're not just talking about our suffering helping people for the sake of eternity, but here and now, that we might be a signpost and advocates for justice. You're going to suffer if you do that. The suffering's not your own. Maybe we should embrace it for the sake of our brothers and sisters who we wouldn't necessarily maybe sometimes say, well, we're brothers and sisters in Christ, but just as mere human beings. The suffering that we do out of love and compassion. It's a letter for Smyrna that a flame might burn blue here. I've gone too long anyway, so I'll stop there. Eyes wide open is what Jesus is saying. We will suffer. Eyes wide open as well. This is not suffering without end, but eyes wide open, might we maybe embrace suffering as a gift from God for us, but for others. It's not lost on me that if you go into modern day Turkey, it's one of the things that if you look at the most concentrated areas of Christian faith and believers in a predominantly Muslim country and wrestling through different faiths and different religions, Christianity is a minority, but it is in some concentrated areas. And here's what's fascinating to me is that out of all of the 7 letters to these 7 cities, the only city that's actually still a city is Smyrna. We just know it now as Izmir, Turkey, which is still where one of the largest concentration percentage-wise of Christians exist. And I'm not necessarily beyond thinking that's not some mere coincidence. That maybe this was the church out of the 7 that really said, okay, we'll suffer. It's not suffering without end, but we'll suffer for the sake of not only us, but for others. Maybe that's why they're the only ones still around. Is they knew the whole story and nothing but the story, and they lived it faithfully unto death. Let's pray. God, we thank you for the messages that you give to the church because we recognize that these are messages to us as a church. And I pray that you would continue to speak to us and move us. Stir in us a healthier understanding of the ministry of suffering for us and for those around us. To always keep it in check and in balance and tension with the hope that we know we have. But God, we don't want to shrink back and hide out.